Hello, and welcome to the Rhetorical Remix podcast. My name is Mike Waugh, and I'll be your host today. Over the past decade, debates over free speech on campus have become increasingly divisive. On one hand, free speech absolutists believe that the domination of college campuses by left-leaning academics have led to the suppression of more conservative ideas on campus. A system of such bias, according to these advocates, is the disinvitation of controversial speakers. On the other hand, those who desire more limitations on the expression of speech usually pursue these limitations in order to prevent what they perceive to be the marginalization of minority students. These advocates also point out bias in the speech of speakers, or in some case other students, as symptoms of a system that perpetuates this marginalization. Much of the disagreement about the issue revolves around differing ideas about the purpose of the university and how free speech plays a role in the fulfillment of that purpose. But no middle ground will be found, no rapprochement between the two sides will occur, unless a common vocabulary can be established. We have to make sure we are talking about the same things when we talk about free speech, censorship, and community. Therefore, what we need is a glossary of terms, something we can look to in order to inform our discussion and help us get closer to a common understanding of the issue. So the first thing we need to discuss is the concept of free speech. It seems simple enough. Free speech can be defined as the ability to say whatever you want. This basic understanding is mostly correct, but there is a jurisprudence, a legal history, regarding speech that both limits speech and contextualizes it. For example, speech that encourages people to engage in immediate acts of violence has been prohibited by the Supreme Court. Speech has also been contextualized. We cannot engage in slander or libel. What we say, especially regarding our claims about someone else, have to be true. Of course, there are good reasons for keeping these boundaries where they are. The minute we begin thinking of regulating speech, questions immediately arise. Who gets to decide what new limitations will be imposed? What topics will be deemed out of bounds? These are legitimate and serious questions, and they have been informed by the First Amendment throughout our country's history. But they do not change the fact that speech always occurs within a context, and those contexts have boundaries. For our purposes today, free speech has a context, the college campus. Just as protest has a contextual boundary against imminent incitement, and claims have the contextual boundary of truth, the college campus should have certain boundaries meant to protect against harmful effects. This is not as censorious as it sounds, and we will talk about censorship in this glossary of terms. But to impose normative expectations about speech is not new territory. These expectations, which could be informed by the definition I am about to propose, do not constitute some legal mandate. The definition of speech and the others offered here are meant to inform policy about the speech on campus, and are meant to provide a common ground for thinking about speech. So how should we define free speech within the context of a college campus? Here is my definition. Free speech is a means of inquiry into all matters that pertain to a chosen line of study. Thinking of free speech as a means to an end does introduce some expectations. First, as a means, it should be used as a tool. If speech is being used to stereotype or caricaturize an individual or group, it is not being used as a tool, and therefore exceeds the natural boundary implied by the definition. Secondly, if speech is a means to inquiry, this means that it is subject to potential correction. Since the context of the speech we're talking about is a college campus, the notion that some ideas are factually wrong, or at the very least need to be challenged, should be welcomed as an opportunity to learn. In fact, we should look at speech as a means of inquiry in order to encourage risk-taking. Learning happens when we open new and unexplored lines of inquiry and test them against traditional orthodoxies. So far, a lot of the discussion has revolved around the important issue of context. It is important to recognize that this context is a physical space for most students, though for us in this English 313 class, it is a digital space. For many students, the physical space of campus is more than just a place to learn. It is in many ways a community with its own culture and rhythms of life. So, What does that mean for a conceptualization of campus? My own definition of a community is that it is a collection of individuals who may have divergent values, but who share some fundamental goals. Therefore, a college campus, as a community, is a collection of students with divergent values, but who share the common goal of learning. We should not assume that these values are so divergent that a common framework for learning becomes impossible, but we should consider what it means to be part of a community of learning, and what it means to help others learn alongside us. This consideration has implications for speech. If the common goal is learning, we should work to make sure that everyone feels they can learn while on the physical space of campus. Efforts to marginalize others through speech, not exercise to investigate, but rather denigrate, makes this goal impossible. It also sends the message that the physical space of campus can be invaded by forces inimical to learning, and so some students no longer feel the space is safe enough to continue in their efforts to learn. So how should we define the concept of the safe space? First, we should not conceptualize a safe space as a definite place with physical boundaries, such as a room, where people go to escape speech they do not like, and in which only certain lines of inquiry are allowed. Defining safe spaces in this way works against better notions of how the entire physical space of campus, think of all the classrooms and conference centers, can be conceived of as a place in which the main goal, the pursuit of knowledge, can be accomplished. Therefore, with these things in mind, a safe space is a place in which open lines of inquiry can be expressed, but also abides by the norms of the inquiry described above. That is, it is also a space where speech as a weapon of denigration is not allowed. But wait, isn't that censorship? Censorship, as defined by Merriam-Webster's dictionary, is the act of deleting material considered sensitive or harmful. You could add that it is also the act of suppressing speech. These are useful definitions, and I would not change them, but I would argue for the policy prescription I alluded to above, a policy that allows for contextual boundaries which are meant to establish norms that facilitate goals like learning. Lines of inquiry require speech, but speech should not be an excuse for marginalizing others. So we must reinforce the idea that speech means challenging orthodoxies through inquiry, even at the risk of making some people uncomfortable with certain implications. But we also must reimagine speech as a tool and not merely a weapon needed to make a point. It should be noted that parsing these things out will probably be difficult at times, and we should avoid what is commonly referred to as the chilling of speech. Remember our other glossary terms. Free speech is a means of inquiry into all matters pertaining to a chosen line of study. If this is true, then chilling speech would mean that lines of inquiry would be discouraged by administrators, professors, and students alike, or that speakers invited to explore certain lines of thought would be shouted down, even physically assaulted, as in the case of Professor Allison Stanger at Middlebury College. This certainly violates the concept of a safe space as defined above. Of course, when our definitions are considered carefully, some speakers may need to be disinvited from campus, for their goal is not to explore lines of inquiry, but to use rhetoric as a weapon, and therefore compromise the safety of campus as a space for learning. In this, I take my cue from conservative professor Gabriel Rossman at the campus of UCLA, who, when he learned of the invitation of controversialist Milo Yiannopoulos by the campus Republicans, said the following: "The most important reason not to host such a talk is that it is evil on the merits. Your conscience should tell you that you never want anything to do with someone whose entire career is not reasoned argument, but shock jock performance art." On that note, we should consider or try to take away an insight from Rossman's advice. And first, it has to be something more than a simple admonition to be, well, nice. The main thing we should take away from all of this is that we are all responsible, as members of a community where learning is the primary goal, to form a healthy culture of free speech. When Professor Rossman says that hosting a talk by Milo Yiannopoulos would be evil on the merits, he is implying that what the controversialist has to say works against the norms which help us establish the kind of culture which promotes open inquiry. Making the distinction between speakers like Yiannopoulos and other speakers who hold to controversial views would be, in my opinion, a lot easier than some would admit. We have to keep the bigger picture in mind. Free speech in the context of the college campus is a means to discover and learn, and then to share that learning with others. I would like to thank all the listeners, and I would definitely appreciate your thoughts. Some quick attributions here. The quote from Professor Rossman comes from an article on the Volokh Conspiracy blog on Reason.com entitled, "Yes, Milo should be allowed to speak on campus, but that doesn't mean you should invite him." All pictures are labeled for reuse and were found through a filtered Google search. Thank you for your time.